Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. What an unbelievably terrific group. I mean that sincerely. So, and on behalf of the Southborough Board of Selectmen, I'm Paul Cimino. I want to welcome all of you here this morning to Southborough 2040. A terrific aspiration, and as I look out on all these faces, there's some. It's a pretty high-powered group, so I'm very confident about where we head as a town. I want to welcome you here. Thank you for taking time out of your schedules. I want to acknowledge a few people as we get started. First of all, our friends from St. Mark's who are hosting us, Lori Carlson, Bob Meyer, and Mike Wirtz. I want to thank Myrick O'Connell for sponsoring, for being our major sponsor here this morning, and that is Katie Gamble, Maureen Grenier, and Dave McKay. And of course, our special guest, newly minted, old Representative Carolyn Dykema, who is in the back of the room here. Who I'm sure has finally gotten some good sleep in the last couple of days, and we're glad that you're here, obviously. We have some folks from our local economic organizations to mix in with all of you. We appreciate their presence as well. State Office of Business Development, Rob Anderson. The Corridor 9 Chamber, Barbara Clifford, who is standing in here for Karen Chapman, who was not able to join us due to a conflict. From the METROWEST Chamber, Bonnie Biaki is here as well. So, you know, we are here to talk economic development. I'm here to tell you you're going to learn a lot today. The only thing you're going to learn from me is how much, on behalf of the Board of Selectmen, I want to emphasize the importance of this to us. As you know, we recently went to a 5-member board in Southborough from a 3, and I've found in the last 6 months there's hardly anything all 5 of us can agree on. But this is certainly one of them. The importance of this to us and to our town and to the future of everybody here is something that we can't emphasize enough. We're extremely happy to see this group here together. We appreciate the efforts of the economic development team for bringing it together. It's going to be a terrific event. You'll be hearing from 3 experts this morning to talk about where we are and where we're going. And as I said, I think you'll learn quite a bit. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our host, David McKay, from our Economic Development Committee. And again, thank you all for being here. Great
job. Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to see so many friendly and familiar faces, and I want to thank you so much for, well, I want to echo everything that Paul has said in terms of thanking you all for being here. We've got an outstanding group, both our panelists and all of you. We've got most, if not all, of the members of the Economic Development Committee here. So thank you for coming. My name is Dave McKay. I'm a partner at Myrick O'Connell. We're a local law firm in Worcester, Westboro, and Boston. And when I'm not doing that, one of the other things that I'm doing, apart from raising the kids, is chairing our Economic Development Committee, which has been an outstanding experience. This program was put together in cooperation with the Board of Selectmen, so it's really a joint program of the board and the EDC. So we're happy to have their support. I want to give a quick thank you as well to Representative Dykema for being here. A particular thank you to the folks at St. Mark's who have just done an outstanding job, Mike Wirtz and Lori Carlson. This is an outstanding location and a facility, and we certainly appreciate them hosting us today. I would also be remiss if I didn't thank my partners at the firm, and in particular Maureen Grenier and Katie Gamble, who, along with Lori Carlson at St. Mark's, just did an outstanding job putting all of the details of the event together. So certainly appreciate that. Also, in particular, I want to thank our panelists who are all doing this voluntarily to help our town and are committed to economic development. That includes Maureen Dunn from Framingham State, who's right up here, and Barry Bluestone and Alan Clayton Matthews, both from Northeastern. So we certainly appreciate their support. And again, I want to thank each of you in advance for sharing your ideas with us about how we can grow our local economy and make Southborough 2040 the best place that it can possibly be. So just a little bit of quick background about our Economic Development Committee. Folks who aren't particularly active in Southborough local politics may not be aware that we're a brand new committee. We were set up a little over a year ago, about a year and a half ago, and it's an effort that really grew out of the town's master plan process and something called the EDSAT. So you may hear that referred to, and it's the Economic Development Self-Assessment Tool that the folks at Barry Bluestone and the folks at Northeastern developed to help towns assess their strengths and weaknesses and figure out what they can do to do a better job on economic development. So the EDSAT was done a few years ago, and one of the things that came out of that was I think a desire at the town level from the town administrator and the selectmen to set up a committee to really work on this stuff. So that's what we have tried to do. And I think the message coming out of all of that is that Southborough is open for business. You're going to learn a lot of really interesting data about our town that I think we hadn't been talking about in a long time, and in fact probably we didn't really know. And one of the important things that comes out of that is that Southborough is an economic engine. We are a center of job creation, and the town takes the obligation seriously to grow and nurture our local economy. So that's what brings us here today. We have 10 members of the EDC. Like I said, most of them are here, and I want to recognize them. Dan Kalenda, our representative from the Board of Selectmen, Julie Connolly, who is an attorney at in-house counsel at CBS, Mike Wirtz, who is floating around somewhere. He's the assistant head of school and dean of faculty right here at St. Mark's, Tom Moskis from Commerce Bank, Claire Reynolds from CCR Consulting. I knew there she is in the back there. Bill Pizzoni from Day Pitney. Chris Robbins, who needs no introduction to the folks in this room. Thank you, Chris, for all of your efforts in keeping me honest. And from our town officials, Mark Purple, who's our town administrator, and Jen Burney, our town planner. So the objective of the EDC, when we first got together, we tried to figure out, okay, what's important to us and what are we really trying to accomplish? And the objective is to preserve a stable tax rate. That's what we're all about. And we want to do that by encouraging economic growth, growing the tax base, and importantly, making sure that while we do all that, we preserve all the things that we love about Southborough, its charm, its rural character, and so forth. So we believe that those things can live together, and that's our mission. Now, Southborough is fortunate in a lot of ways, and you're going to hear later on from our panelists that we're lucky to have an existing, robust, vibrant, and diversified economy. Our vacancy rate is lower than our neighboring communities, the commercial and industrial vacancies, so we're very lucky in that regard. But I think one could argue that that success is as much the product of luck as it is design. So now that we've got it, we're fortunate enough to have this great local economy. The question is, how do we keep it? And that's why we wanted to bring you here today. How do we keep our diverse mix of businesses and nonprofits growing, and when they're growing right here in Southborough, and if it can't be right here in Southborough, at least in the boroughs plus region in our local economy. So the committee's been hard at work trying to figure out how we do all of that. One of the things we realized is we got to know where we are and who we are before we can make a lot of recommendations to the selectmen about how to grow that economy. And that's where Professor Dunn and the folks at Framingham State and the MetroWest Economic Research Center come in. We commissioned the Merck study, and this is really the first ever analysis, at least that I'm aware of our local economy and the business and nonprofits that we have in our town. We've been working very hard. We got kind of a late start in the economic development game compared to, I know Tim Cummings is out here somewhere, the folks in Marlborough who have done an outstanding job. Westboro has been working on this for a number of years. So we needed to build a basic infrastructure for economic development. And it's a lot of things that that don't grab a lot of headlines and that some folks might not find all that interesting, but if you're going to do this work, you got to have it. And that includes simple things like building a website. So we've hired Penta Communications in Westboro to help us build an economic development website. We're creating a business development guide. In fact, it's been written and it's in the process of getting approved by the folks at Town Hall, so that'll be coming out soon. We've also been doing, we call them customer visits with the local businesses and the nonprofits. We try to do about one every month, and we've been pretty successful in keeping up that schedule. Again, important for us to find out from folks who aren't on the committee how things are going and what the town can do to support them. And we've been doing all of that without any staff, so it's completely a voluntary effort. And special kudos go to Mark Purple and Jen Burney, Vanessa Hale, who have been supporting us in all that while they're doing their full-time real jobs at Town Hall. So we're happy to have their support. The theme of today's program is Southborough 2040. Now, on the EDC, we knew that we wanted to bring folks together to talk about economic development, and this is just the caliber of folks in the room is outstanding. But it was really Barry Bluestone, when we started talking about this program, who said, well, what do you think of this idea? What if we did Southborough 2040? And I said, what do you mean? Is that like a tax return? Like, I didn't know what we... And he said, no, this is a project that we're doing that he had been working on with the mayor of Newton, and they did a similar project, and we thought, wow, that's fascinating, looking 25 years ahead to figure out what our town is going to look like and how we can kind of shape that future. So we're starting with the recognition that things will change, right? If you drove down Route 9 25 years ago, or if you drove up Route 85, a lot different than it is today. And we have no doubt that that's good. Same is going to be true 25 years from now if you do that. But we also know that there are probably some constants, some things that might not change that much. We expect that there's going to be continued fiscal and financial pressure on the town, growing out of an increased need for core services, increased pension costs, increased health care costs, and so forth. So really kind of a recipe for higher taxes, which is one of the things that we're trying to avoid. We also assume that there's going to be continued growth, that there's going to be pressure for additional commercial space and for residential space as well. We also know, and at the risk of pointing out the obvious, they're not making any more land. Southborough's not going to be any bigger 25 years from now than it is today, so we've got to work within our existing footprint. And of course, we know and we support this continued desire to preserve all those things that are special about Southborough. Open space, rural charm, all those things. So that sort of brings us to today's program in Southborough 2040. As Southborough continues to get built out over the next quarter of a century, the question is, what kinds of companies and what kind of projects do we want to bring to our town? And once we identify those, how do we go about getting them? How do we bring them into Southborough? And that's what this panel discussion, and that's what our breakout sessions and our the feedback that we're going to get from you is all about. And we're asking you to help us with our agenda, with the EDC's agenda and the town's agenda on economic development going forward. What should the town and specifically the EDC be doing now to prepare for a better Southborough 2040? And it's a question of priorities, right? We've got limited resources. We've got to prioritize our efforts. So what are the things that you'd like to see us working on? Is it vacancy in commercial and office space? Is it the villages, promoting prosperity in the villages? Is it zoning, permitting, time to work, infrastructure, Route 9? It can be any one of a million things, but we want to make sure that we focus on the things that are most important first and the things that are going to help our business and nonprofit community as much as we possibly can in the shortest amount of time. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our panel. We've got you've got materials in front of you with today's program. Also, all of the PowerPoints are in there. We're fortunate to have Maureen Dunn from Framingham State University. She has some just outstanding expertise in regional employment and economic development. She also gets the local town politics stuff, which we know is really important in doing all this. She's vice chair of Framingham's Economic Development and Industrial Corporation, hopefully I got that right, which is their EDC, and she's also an elected member of the Framingham town meeting. So she knows how this stuff goes, and she knows what it's like to navigate town meeting, which is something that we're all familiar with too. We're also fortunate to have Dr. Alan Clayton Matthews, who is a professor at Northeastern University. By the way, bios are in your packets as well, so if you want to read more about these folks, you can certainly do so there. Dr. Clayton Matthews is the co-editor of Massachusetts Benchmarks, which is a joint publication of UMass and the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. So if you're an economic development and economic data junkie, he's a guy to talk to. And he's also a member of Governor Patrick's Council of Economic Advisors. So I can't emphasize enough how lucky we are to have him and Professor Dunn, and last but not least, Barry Bluestone as well. I want to welcome Barry back to Southborough. Many of you may know his team did our economic development self-assessment tool a couple of years ago. He's the Stearns Trustee Professor of Political Economy, the founding director of the Dukakis Center for Urban and Regional Policy, and the founding dean of the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs at Northeastern. He was an executive advisor to the Governor's Commission on the future of mature industries in Massachusetts, and he works all over the state and across the country helping cities, towns, and states on economic development issues. So I want to thank all of them for being here. We certainly appreciate it. Just a couple logistical items before I turn it over to Professor Dunn. They've closed off this door. You're not trapped in this room. There's a door in the back that you can sneak out. The coffee station will remain open. There may still be a little bit of food if you haven't gotten anything yet. So please do that. If you can turn off your cell phones, that would be great so we don't have too many cell phones ringing. I had to be reminded to do that myself. And then at the end of the program, we'll have an intermission, just a brief break after the panel presentations and before the roundtables. So we can take a break then. But at the very end of the program, we can help shuttle folks back to the parking areas. We're going to need to kind of navigate you through the school, so we can certainly help you with that. So without further ado, Professor Dunn, take it away. Thank you very much.
Welcome. Thank you, Dave, for your kind introduction. I'm assisted today by Terry Aka, a Merck senior intern. And what is Merck? The METROWEST Economic Research Center. Founded in 1991 at Framingham State, Merck is a regional economic research center. We produce sub-state economic data and analysis. I'm going to lower this a little to my face. And publish and present the findings and educate through a competitive internship program. Merck currently covers about 1/8 the state, including our home region, Metro West. Just a reminder, Merck does not advocate a particular position. Instead, we make factual data and analysis available to enable communities like yours to make good choices. My opinions will appear in the panel discussion. Today I'll focus on Southborough employment, the historical trend, current industrial structure, and the importance of preserving your economic advantages. Alan will follow looking at the state. Please hold your questions, by the way, to the end. Thank you. Southborough is well favored at the intersection of major transportation routes, home to nearly 10,000 residents. Southborough offers a very highly educated labor force of 5,000. 2/3 of you have a bachelor's degree and 1/3 a graduate degree. That's nearly twice the state rate and triple the national rate. Your unemployment rate of 4.3% was well below the state and nation. But little was known about your industrial base of the Southborough EDC Commission, the Merck Report. Why? To have a clear knowledge of your industrial base to plan your future economic course. Local knowledge is key to good choices. And I say that as a Framingham Town Meeting member too. In addition, there's unrelenting competitive pressure, okay, from other communities, other states, other nations for firms and jobs. Communities large and small must be knowledgeable and proactive about business retention and recruitment. The Greater Metro West region's 13 communities shown here include Southborough, dead center in the middle. We're a powerful leading edge economy, home to the industries essential to the state's future. Biotech, headquarters, health, engineering, R&D, trade. Metro West generates 5.5% of the state's employment, 6.5% of its payroll. But our region has a volatile history. It's important that you see how the larger region around Southborough has fared over the 3 decades, because you're part of it. Here's our roller coaster economy, showing total employment since 1980. And it's important, when I'm talking about employment, I'm talking about jobs cited in a particular town or region. Jobs may or may not be held by the residents. Over the whole period, jobs rose from 112,400 on the left in 1980 to 178,000 in 2012 on the right, up 66,000 jobs, 58%. Along the way, though, okay, we've experienced 4 major business cycles with peaks in 1988, 2001, 2008, and troughs in 1982, 91, 2003, and 2009. Hence the roller coaster. Today, Greater Metro West has recovered from the Great Depression with new 2013 data showing jobs the highest since the 2008 peak. We expect an expansion to continue. Now that you've seen our Greater Metro West economy, what does Southborough look like? First, though, I want to show among the 13 communities, Southborough is the little red line across the top, a small but turns out important player in our regional economy. Let's look at Southborough more closely. Okay, this is Southborough itself. We're looking at jobs located, cited at places of work in the town of Southborough. In contrast to Greater Metro West, good news, with occasional dips, Southborough employment has climbed steadily from 3,400 in 1980 to a historical peak of 7,600 jobs in 2008, just before the Great Recession. In 2012, Southborough employment was around 7,400. The largest gains occurred in 1990 and 2000. The largest job losses in 1995 and 2009, the Great Recession. Since 1980, however, Southborough jobs doubled, climbing at an average annual rate of 2.4%, 3 times the annual increase for our much slower growing Massachusetts, and twice the annual gain for the US. Jobs create payroll. Payroll is the cost of employers, of workers really, including wages and benefits to the employer. And how did these jobs, what kind of payroll did these jobs create over the 3 decades? While employment doubled, Southborough nominal payroll not corrected for inflation, rose tenfold from 56 million in 1980 to a record 560 million in 2012. 2012, over $500 million in payroll was generated by business companies, etc., nonprofits in Southborough. What you learn from these last 2 slides is that while employment and payroll both grew, payroll grew rose much faster than employment, reflecting increasing numbers of high-wage jobs. That's what's going on here. So let's look at what happened to wages over 3 decades. First, an explanation. The average wages going up are not your take-home pay. There's often confusion on this. Instead, it's total payroll divided by employment, so it includes base pay, overtime, annual leave, benefits, stock options, bonuses. Think of it as the cost to the employer of a job. Okay, now, we'll start with the U.S. The average annual wage for jobs, U.S. jobs in black, climbed from $14,400 in 1980 to a record $60,900 in 2012. I'm sorry, $49,300 in 2012. Massachusetts now, and if you notice, in 1980, we had lower wages statewide, okay, relative to the nation. And we climbed from 1380 to a record 60,900, 24% higher than the U.S. Back in 1980, we were not a high-wage nation, high-wage state relative to the nation. Now we are. Okay. Meanwhile, Greater Metro West in green rose to 70,400, greatly exceeding the state and nation. Okay. Greater Metro West is a high-wage region in a high-wage state. And what about Southborough? For over 3 decades, the Southborough average wage has exceeded the nation, the state, and the region, a remarkable record. In 2012, Southborough produced a record wage of $75,800, 8% higher than the nation, but than the region, 24% higher than the state, and 54% higher than the U.S. Southborough establishments pay high wages for their jobs, reflecting the high value added of the goods and services produced here and the high skills of the employed labor force. Lots of places around the globe, however, want these very jobs. Okay, so let's look at the employers, okay? How many establishments are located in Southborough? Every establishment or separate place of work counts as one, by the way. So if you have like 2 mobile gas stations, there would be 2 establishments. The number of Southborough establishments tripled over this period to a record 430 places of work in 2012. Southborough increased its number of establishments at a 3.8% annual clip, twice the rate of Massachusetts in the U.S. As a result, by 2012, it was home to one of every 24 Greater Metro West businesses. So what you now know from looking at this historical piece is that Southborough has experienced a remarkable increase in employment, payroll, wages, and establishments. Setbacks have been relatively brief. The overall trend has been growth at a rate exceeding the state and nation, more in keeping with our high-tech Metro West. So let's look at the most recent annual data, a point-in-time view of Southborough employment, and then we'll break that information down. Total employment is, the 2013 numbers, which just came out, are in green. Rising, total payroll, up as well. 2013 turned out to be a good year. Average annual wage, again increasing. And the only decline occurred, slight decline in total establishments, which we'll talk a little bit about later. So this is kind of the overview, point in time, looking at your town, industrial sectors. Okay, so we're going to break this down and look at employment and see where the jobs in establishments are. NAICS is the North American Industrial Classification System that divides businesses and their jobs into 11 super sectors, and they're divided based on the process used at their place of work. All jobs in one establishment, such as a medical center, okay, from the CEO right down to the nurse's aide, are classified into the super sector education and health, because that's what is provided at this place. That's the process at this place of work. It's a health facility. So let's look at Southborough's 7,400 jobs by super sector. Here we are. By the variety of colors, you can see that your economy is diverse. And that, by the way, is a very good finding. Starting at the top, 12 o'clock position, is natural resources in green, almost non-existent, construction, okay, then manufacturing in red. This was a big surprise, okay? Nearly 1/5 of the region. In this region, by the way, manufacturing is R&D based. We're talking about EMC, Genzyme, small engineering firms. We're not talking about assembly line widgets. Okay. Trade, transportation, and utilities in green, about 11%. This is wholesale, retail, trade, transportation, and utilities. Information, very tiny software. Financial activities like banks and real estate, also tiny. Another biggie in blue, professional business services. Okay, 1/5 of your jobs. This includes a big, important sector, the Southborough, professional, scientific, and technical services, with a lot of professional services and R&D tucked in there. Headquarters in administrative and waste management. Education and health. This is your largest super sector. Includes private education, like right here, all of St. Mark's employment is right up there, okay? And health services like the Autism Center I drove by on Route 9. That would also be in here. A lot of your nonprofits would be tucked in here. Okay. Finally, leisure and hospitality in purple. This is the restaurants, other services in orange. This is a catch-all, includes funeral homes. And finally, public in gray. All federal, state, and local jobs are here. And this includes the Southborough Public Schools. An important note when you look at this pie is the little tiny gray wedge. 90% of your jobs are in the private sector in the town of Southborough. Okay. Education and health leads, followed by professional business services, manufacturing, and trade. These big four produce nearly 3/4 of your town's employment. So the good news is your economy is quite diverse. All the eggs are not in one basket, okay? And we do see that in some towns, that you have highly concentrated, a single employer, for example. You do not have that here. But how does it compare to the state? And why do we want the local graph? This is the important piece. On the left, you can see Southborough with its 4 super sectors dominating town employment: education and health, professional business services, manufacturing, trade. Okay. On the right is the much larger Massachusetts economy, where 4 super sectors provide 2/3 of state employment: education and health, like Southborough, but trade in the second position. Professional business services, they're in public fourth. A very different grouping, and Alan will be talking on the state in more detail. In Southborough, manufacturing, professional business services, and education and health produce higher higher concentrations of employment than existed in statewide. For example, if you look at manufacturing, Southborough is twice the concentration of the state of Massachusetts. Your economy is not the same as the state's, and that, by the way, is true of virtually every town. It's important to base your local decisions on what actually exists in Southborough. Look at Southborough first. Okay. Now that we have a good handle on jobs by supersector, let's look at the payroll they create, and you'll see a different profile. Southborough establishments produced over $500 million in payroll in 2012. Manufacturing, the town's 3rd largest employer, led with the highest payroll, $156 million, a quarter of the town payroll. PBS was virtually identical, professional business services. So while your employment is quite diverse, payroll is far more concentrated, with 2 super sectors, manufacturing and professional business services, generating half of the entire Southborough payroll. Education and health and trade, who are also large employers, combined produced another 26%. And the remaining 7 super sectors only had a little bit of 20%. So what you see is 2 big players in terms of payroll, with over half the payroll coming out of both of those. So how do super sectors, who have relatively smaller percentages of employment, manufacturing, for example, capture larger shares of payroll? And this gets to do with wages. Here you can see the Southborough wages by super sector. Hopefully these come up nicely. Thank you. Okay. For Southborough, manufacturing in red led all super sectors with an average annual wage of $120,400. This is where the big payroll is coming from. A tad above, information, but remember, information is a little small super sector. Financial activities was 3rd, but big professional and business services, $95,600. Trade, transportation, and green, construction. Okay. These are your high flyers in terms of payroll. 3 out of the 4 largest super sectors in terms of employment, manufacturing, professional business services, and trade, offered average annual wages exceeding $75,000 a year. For workers holding these jobs, that news is great. Okay? But education and health, the town's largest super sector in terms of employment, offered a much lower wage at $45,100. Roughly half of the highest. And finally, I'd like you to look at leisure and hospitality, where the wage is $17,100 annually, and often part-time with no benefits. It takes 6 leisure and hospitality jobs to make a manufacturing wage. This gap is enormous for individuals who hold low-wage jobs. And it's something to think about in terms of your town. Okay. Let's look at the establishments that pay these wages, and how many are there in each super sector? And by the way, how big are they? Southborough is home to 430 establishments or separate places of work. 60% are in 3 super sectors. Blue, professional business services with 120, followed by green, trade, transportation, utilities with 80, and other services with 60s. Okay. But wait a minute. Okay. We expected many establishments in professional business services and trade because they had lots of jobs. But what happened to the first and third largest super sectors in terms of employment? Education and health and manufacturing. Education and health has only 35 establishments, and manufacturing only 15. The numbers of firms in a town tell only part of the story. How big the establishments are tells more of the story. Southborough averages 17 jobs per establishment. The average place of work has 17 jobs, but a huge variation exists among Southborough employers. Manufacturing, okay, with only 15 establishments, averages 87 jobs, paying $120,400 each. Okay, PBS on average only has 13 jobs. Okay, so the gain or loss of a high-wage manufacturer, okay, with its 87 jobs, would have a major impact on the town. You want PBS means on average with 13 jobs would be affected. You want both types of businesses in a town, small, like professional business services, and large, like manufacturing, to thrive in the future. Okay. So as of right now, when we look at Southborough, highly diverse in employment, more concentrated in terms of payroll, 4 super sectors playing critical roles: education and health, professional business services, manufacturing, and trade. Overall wages are remarkably high, with a couple of exceptions that are quite low. With 3 super sector exceptions, your establishments are typically small, many less than 10 employees per place of work. And lastly, we need to go back and see how Southborough fits within the economic engine of Greater Metro West. Among the 13 communities in this region, Southborough ranks 8th in terms of employment. With its over $500 million plus in payroll, Southborough ranks 7th. Southborough shines as a leader in average annual wages, 3rd in the region. Only Hopkinton and Marlborough establishments pay more. However, Southborough lags a bit, and we'll talk about this in the panel, a bit in the number of establishments at 9, and you might want to keep an eye on this. In summary, from an economic development standing, Southborough is very fortunate. You have very good findings to move forward in terms of planning. 3 decades of sustained growth, employment and payroll wages, high average wages, a strong, diverse economic base, and 4 important key super sectors. And in the panel discussion, I will give you some more of opinions that is not work-based. I'd like to now turn the mic over to Alan, who will be, Southborough, in the end, is part of the larger state, which Alan will be. We're all little parts of a big state. And he'll talk about the state's future, to be followed by Barry, who will be looking at the real future, demographic trends. Thank you very much.
Okay, all right. So let's go right. First, I'm going to talk about the state's current conditions, and you can go to the next slide. And let's go one more slide. So, you know, there are a lot of interconnections between local, state, the national, and the world economies. Because when you think about it, the state economy is just the sum of all the local economies. The national economy, the sum of all the state economies, and the world economy, the sum of all the national economies. But there are interactions. So the Southborough economy is affected by the state, which is affected by the nation, which is affected by the world. So it's all interconnected. So I'm going to show you some slides about the Massachusetts economy. I'll often be comparing them to the U.S. economy because of this interconnection and interaction. So in these slides, I've tried to keep it so Massachusetts will be in blue, right? Perhaps as it should be or was, and the U.S. in red. So this slide is comparing gross domestic product growth between the U.S. in red and Massachusetts in blue. And this is the sort of bottom line measure of overall economic activity, the value of goods and services produced. These are adjusted for inflation. So what this slide is showing is in 2014, if you see that next to last panel, it says that in the first 3 quarters of the year, both the state and national economies have been growing at roughly the same rate. The winter last year was really bad. Economies were declining in terms of growth. We had a rebound in the second quarter of this year, and sort of a return to more normal growth in this last quarter that's just finished. Now can you set up that movie? So this is a short movie which has gone viral for economists. So if you like this movie, you know that you really have the economist blood in you. And we don't start it yet. Can we pause it if it started? Yeah. Can we? Yeah, there we go. Good. So let me tell you what this is going to show. This is showing employment growth in blue and employment or losses, job losses in red. The size of the circle is the growth for each major metropolitan area. So you see New York there is a big circle because it's a big metropolitan area and it had a lot of jobs growth in the year ending in June 1999. You can see the Boston metro area just to the northeast of it, a smaller circle, but plenty of job growth in the year ending in June 1999 there. So let me just tell you what you're going to see. You're going to see how growth evolves. And I want you to notice a couple things. One is that how correlated metro areas' growths are across the nation. When the nation is growing, almost all metro areas tend to grow, and when the nation is declining, almost all metro areas tend to decline. If you focus on the Boston metro area really closely, you'll see, we're going to look at two business cycles here. You'll see how in the prior business cycle, the dot-com bust, how we were one of the metro areas that was hurt really bad, lost jobs among the first and went back to job gains among the last. And whereas in the most recent Great Recession, we were one of the last metro areas to enter the recession, one of the first to come out of it. So you're going to see two business cycles. Also pay attention to around 2005, you'll see the effects of Hurricane Katrina. And you'll also see what's happening to Detroit about that same time. And at the beginning of the Great Recession, you'll see where it breaks out first, in those areas which had speculative home building and great price rises. So let's play the video, and we'll just watch it. So this is going month by month. It's like a heartbeat of the economy. And you can see the date there. We're in May 2000. This is the dot-com bust. The recovery is coming, but Massachusetts, Boston metro area, one of the last to get out of it. The economy's growing. Katrina is coming. Poor Detroit. Here it comes. And this is about where we are now. So, we've been in a recovery now. This is the 5th year. It's been fairly steady, affecting almost the whole country. Only a few metro areas are not growing. Okay, so we can go back to the slides. Thank you. All right, so next slide. So I just want to look at a few indicators for Massachusetts. In my estimates of gross state product growth for Massachusetts, those are based essentially on 4 economic indicators. I just want to show you those real quickly. One is payroll employment growth in the state of Massachusetts. This is year-over-year growth in blue for Massachusetts and red for the U.S. So you can see that this recession hurt Massachusetts less than the nation as a whole. Massachusetts in blue, employment became negative later than the country as a whole, so job growth was positive for longer. We didn't lose as many jobs. The blue line doesn't go as far south as it does for the U.S. And job growth became positive again sooner than it did for the U.S. And in the recovery, we've been growing at about the same rate of job growth as the nation, which is actually quite good for Massachusetts since we have slower population growth. Next slide. The unemployment rate in Massachusetts tends to be lower than the country as a whole, and it was in this recession partly because the recession wasn't as severe here, but it also reflects the higher level of educational attainment that we have in Massachusetts. If you have a college degree, you're much less likely to be unemployed than if you have a high school diploma or less. Next slide. These next two slides are two other indicators that are very good at tracking the state of the Massachusetts economy. One is wage and salary disbursements. We get a great measure on that every month from withholding taxes, and that's been growing well in this recovery. And the next slide shows sales, the spending on items that are subject to the regular sales tax and motor vehicle sales tax. So that gives you a good feel for household spending, but also business spending. Business spending is a large part of this as well. And next slide. World and national technology markets are important for Massachusetts, and as we can see, they're important for Southborough as well. And so these are just two measures of world and national markets. The one on the left is semiconductor sales, the worldwide market. You can see a couple recessions there, but it's been growing very well and growing pretty good this year as well. Now, this is worldwide sales. We don't have sales for Massachusetts, but this organization does break it down by region of the world, and one of the regions is the Americas, which is essentially the U.S., and interestingly, the market share of the Americas has actually risen somewhat in this recovery. We have a larger market share of the world market now than we did before this last recession. And the slide on the part on the right is investment in research and development expenditures in the U.S. And that's been growing moderately in the last quarter, but has been growing fairly well during this recovery, and that's good for Southborough. Let's look at the next several years. The next slide. So this is what the picture for payroll employment growth looks like, for job growth. Massachusetts in blue again, the U.S. in red. We're right now in the middle of 2014. This is from my New England Economic Partnership forecast. What we see here is a modest acceleration in growth, both for the state and the region, through the beginning of 2016. To about a 2% rate for Massachusetts, which is very solid growth for Massachusetts. Thereafter, growth will slow. And notice that in Massachusetts, job growth will essentially diminish and end by the end of 2018. That is actually due to the demographics of the aging of the workforce, and I'll have some more comments on that at the end. Next slide. These are where the jobs will be over the next 5 years, and actually this looks good for Southborough because the fastest growing sector in the state will be professional and business services, followed by construction, leisure, hospitality, but education and health services will also be growing faster than the state. The super sectors that will follow the state's growth, grow more slowly than the state, will be financial services, other services, trade, transportation, utilities, manufacturing, and following the PAC, government. But all sectors will be growing, and even for manufacturing, don't take that as a weakness for the state. Any positive growth in manufacturing is good because that's still a large sector with jobs that pay much better than average, as Maureen showed you. And so that bodes good for Southborough as well. Next, I want to comment on some of the concerns I have about the state of the economy. Well, here's the housing market is the first one. This is the Case-Shiller House Price Index for the Boston metro area. And you can see that prices fell during this housing bust. The bust started here earlier than in the nation as a whole. But we've recovered most of those price losses. But in the past few months, single-family home prices have begun to decline a bit, so that's a bit of a worry. The next slide shows my principal concern here, and it suggests that the housing market is not back to a healthy place yet. This is the number of building permits, which essentially leads construction just by a few months. And we can see here how they fell during the housing bust and the recession. They fell statewide to really depression-era levels. And although they've grown on a percentage basis pretty well since then, housing permits now, and therefore housing starts, is still only a fraction of what they were before this recession began. Now, does that reflect a shift in preferences, especially for young households, away from buying to renting? Perhaps, but it could also reflect a couple other things. How hard it is to get a mortgage these days. Credit's harder to get. That may be holding down consumers, households, people's ability to buy houses. That holds down the construction market. But it could be due to just as a weakness in parts of the economy, and that's what I want to get to next in the next slide. The labor market is far from full health. We have two measures of the unemployment rate. The official one, which is called the U3 for those geeks, that's the one that's really that's the bottom line unemployment rate, the headline rate. And right now in Massachusetts, that's I think at 6%. I think. This is the U6 unemployment rate, which includes also those who are working part-time but want to work full-time. So in effect, they're underemployed. And it also includes those people who have not looked for work in the past 4 weeks. Those include discouraged workers or those who are marginally attached. The discouraged workers say, well, I haven't looked in the past 4 weeks because I don't believe jobs are available. If you look at that unemployment rate for the U.S. in red and Massachusetts in blue, and the green line is just a smooth version of that blue, you can see that this unemployment rate jumped rapidly in this Great Recession and has only declined very slowly, and it's still very high both in the nation and in Massachusetts at about 12%. Next slide. How well you do in this economy in Massachusetts depends upon your level of educational attainment. This measure here is the unemployment rate, a very important measure, and it shows the vast difference between those who have very little education, less than a high school education, their unemployment rate's over 15%, to those who have a bachelor's degree or higher at the bottom, their unemployment rate is around 4%, as it is in Southborough here, right, around that level. So this great disparity between how well you do in the economy and your level of educational attainment. And in the next slide, that shows some of the impact on this on the geography of the state. This shows unemployment rates for it's a while in the past, December 2011, but I'll tell you, the message this picture is giving is really no different now, and was really no different 5 years ago, and will probably be no different 5 years from now. It shows that what parts of the state are doing well. Those municipalities in the Boston metro area, especially to the west, like where we are, and the north and the south, that's the brightest yellow. Those are the communities that have the lowest unemployment rates. And those include the area around Amherst, the colleges, the very western part of the state, which has a lot of wealthy second homes and also good tourism. The areas that are doing bad are in the darker colors, towards the greens, the darker greens, the blue and the black. And it's those black colors, those cities and towns that are really doing bad. Springfield, Lawrence, New Bedford, a lot of the gateway cities and the other urban areas outside Boston. So this really shows how unequal not only the recovery has been, but how unequal the economy is in Massachusetts. And the next slide is actually pretty disturbing. This is the poverty rate in Massachusetts, the overall poverty rate in blue. And you can see that that's been rising in the past several years. And indeed, if you look at a 10-year moving average, it's higher now than it has been in the years I have this data for, going back to the mid-1980s. So that is a concern. And let me just talk for a second about the effects of poverty and say that poverty is really not a problem of Southborough, but it is a problem for Southborough. Poverty is holding down the growth of the economy. And this is true not just in Massachusetts, but in the nation as a whole, and indeed in the world. The Federal Reserve Bank has been worried about having inflation that's too low. The European Central Bank is now worried about the same thing in Europe. Japan has had this problem now for a long time. Poverty holds down consumer spending because it's middle-income households and lower-income households and poor households who spend the highest proportion of their income. So if they don't have income to spend, that slows down the economy, and that has affected this recovery and is affecting the world economy. Secondly, poverty is really saying that, and this is true in Massachusetts, that there's an underused potential. Poverty means that too many people don't have the education and skills necessary to participate productively in the economy. And it means that too many children have poor prospects for getting those skills as they grow up. And this is really key for Massachusetts because we're going to need a big, highly educated labor force and growth in that labor force to replace the retiring baby boom generation. Next slide shows one of the possible solutions to this problem. One part of the solution is greater public investments in both human and physical capital. If we improve the infrastructure and transportation system here, we can draw businesses to the state and also draw more households to the state. They'll be able to get around easier and find jobs easier. Secondly, by investing in human capital, improving our K through 12 system, which is a nice public school system, but it still can be improved through programs like preschool programs. That has been shown to be very effective in reducing poverty, but also even going back to natal programs and prenatal programs, that can reduce poverty as well. And we have the capacity to do that. We're a very wealthy state. We have the second biggest capacity to raise state tax revenues in the nation, at least in the last study I looked at a few years ago. Connecticut was the first. So we have the ability to afford these public investments in human and physical capital. What the red line is showing is just that on a real basis, state-owned tax revenues per capita haven't risen since the mid-90s, but income certainly has risen a lot. And finally, what this is all leading to is this is my forecast for the labor force in Massachusetts through 2018. And this is why one of the first slides I showed you on payroll employment, we saw the number of job growth decline to 0 by the end of 2018. It's because we won't have the labor force for it. There'll be as many people exiting the labor force because they're retiring in 2018 as there will be new people entering the labor force. And this is one of the reasons why I'm so concerned about this poverty problem. One of the places we can get a bigger labor force is by increasing graduation rates of high school kids in this state, and they're very low in many metropolitan areas. Increasing the propensity that kids go on to get a 2-year degree or a 4-year degree, and that'll boost the labor force for Massachusetts and help avoid this problem. Because here's just, I'm an economist. I'm going to leave you on like a dismal note, perhaps. I'm relying on Barry to pick you up, right? but here's the analysis of regional growth by Paul Krugman. Now, you may know Paul Krugman as the left of center economic sort of journalist and commentator, but he did get a Nobel Prize, yes. And he got it for a really good reason. He really studied regional economies and metropolitan economies, And one of the things he found was that if an economy stops growing, and if the labor force doesn't grow, and if it begins to decline, and if you project this, it will begin to decline after 2018, here's the problem. If the decline can reach a point where it accelerates, and it's a tipping point. And here's how this works. One of the reasons we've been such a successful economy is businesses locate here, especially high-tech, high-paying businesses, ones that need knowledge service workers, is because they know we have a large, highly educated workforce. Not just highly educated, but also large. Size matters, because they can come here, they know that I can get my workers I need, I can bid them away from other businesses because there's a large labor force. If that labor force starts growing and starts shrinking, that incentive for businesses to locate won't be here. And that can be part of the dynamic which leads to a downward spiral, which we want to avoid. And so I'll leave it to Barry to solve this problem. Thank you.
So thank you very much for inviting us here today. And I have to tell you, you have just experienced two of the finest presentations I've ever heard in almost 50 years of being an economist. So I want to really thank Maureen and Alan. And they're going to make my job much easier because I had a bunch of slides here that you've already seen, and I want to just look at a few of those. And then I want to pick up where Alan was talking about, and that is look at the potential, not real, but potential demographic changes that we'll have here in Southborough, based on data that was recently put together by the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, which is the official planning agency for much of eastern Massachusetts. So let's just go to a couple slides here. If you just click through a couple until I tell you to stop, okay? One, first of all here, is you see the employment growth that Maureen talked about here in Southborough, and that represents almost a 25% increase in employment between 2001 and 2014. That's spectacular. You do notice, however, that the Great Recession that Alan talked about really slowed that down, so that by 2001 to 2008, we'd had that more than 25% increase in employment. Then it slowed down, although by 2012 we were almost back to where we were before the Great Recession, and by 2014 we were at an all-time high. That's great. Next slide. You saw this already. Next slide. Next slide. Same thing. Next slide. This is what Maureen. Here was the interesting thing I just want to add to this, and that is based on the same data that Maureen has, you can see where we had the most rapid growth in Southborough employment between 2001 and 2012. Clearly, professional and technical services jumps up 82%. So employment was up 25% across the board, but here it's up 82% in professional and technical services, 67% in arts, entertainment, and recreation, 65% in finance and insurance, and again, 58% in healthcare. We lost some jobs over there in real estate, construction, and so forth. So that is what you see in terms of the way the Southborough economy is changing, and it's changing with the structure of the overall American economy. More professional services, more in arts and entertainment, more in finance and insurance, much more in health, and also education services. Next slide. So what I want to really talk about, and again, we'll be able to do this in a few minutes, take a break, and then we'll have a panel discussion where you can, it's your turn. I want to show you what the demographic future might look like. If we could go to the first slide, you'll see what the population of Southborough was between 1990, when there were about 6,600 residents here in Southborough. It rose to about 8,800 by 2000, and by the 2010 census, it was just below 10,000, as Maureen suggested. What about the future? Well, the MAPC does a projection, which is based on if we follow the trends over the last decade of births, deaths, immigration from other countries, domestic in-migration, which is the net difference between people moving into Southborough from the rest of the world, including the rest of Massachusetts, not the rest of the world, rest of the country, versus out-migration, people leaving Southborough for somewhere else, old folks going to Miami. And what you'll see, if you go back one slide, is that by 2020, the projection shows not much growth. And this is getting closer to what Alan was concerned about in terms of labor force growth. And even by 2030, going out 16 years from now, we are at a growth rate of about 600 more residents in Southborough than we have today. Okay? So very, very slow growth. And in fact, if you even take it out to 2040, it remains about that same level. Okay? But that's not the problem. Here's the problem. Next slide. One thing, and I know the superintendent of public schools is here, right here. You saw fairly significant growth in the population of school-age children, so that about 28% of the total population of Southborough in 1990 was made up of kids 0 to 19. That grew to a full third of the population of Southborough. But by 2010, it was still just about a third. So the big growth in the children's population leveled off and is expected to fall rather dramatically. Now, you may have projections of your own, which I hope you'll talk about, Ms. Johnson, but it would suggest that if these projections hold, and again, that's the big if these projections hold, your school-age population is actually going to fall fairly dramatically and will continue to fall through 2030. And that has to do with what is happening to family structure. Some of it has to do with delayed childbearing, but most of it has to do with the changing age distribution of Southborough. Next slide. Here is what's happening to 20 to 34-year-olds. Those are people who normally have children. They made up 21% of the population in 1990. They were down to only 12% of the population by 2000. By 2010, they were down to 8.5% of the population. So those kind of young folks are not locating here. Now, some of them are your kids, and they've left Southborough. Some of them have left Massachusetts. My 23-year-old, who graduated not from Northeastern, but from Northwestern University in June, which, by the way, is just kind of like Northeastern plus roughly $250,000, has stayed in Chicago. And I don't know if we're going to get him back except for Thanksgiving, but here's somebody who has gone somewhere else. And for a long time in Massachusetts, we were losing those young people because we didn't have the jobs for them. They're now starting to come back. They're overwhelmingly coming back to Boston, Cambridge, and Somerville. 20 to 34-year-olds made up 33.4%, one-third of the population of Boston, Somerville, and Cambridge in the year 2000. But between 2000 and 2010, 3/4 of the net population growth in those three communities was made up of 20 to 34-year-olds. So the brain drain that we worried about a decade ago has reversed, but it's the Kendall Squares, it's the Somerville Assembly Square, it's Boston that is coming back in and bringing these young people here. Now, the question is, will young folks want to stay in Southborough? And I'm going to argue the answer may be yes, but that's what we're going to talk about. Let's take a look at 35 to 64-year-olds. Next slide. Right? We had a growth from about 42% of the population in 1990 to a little bit more, 46% in 2000, and it peaked at almost half of the population. Now that's terrific, because that's the prime age workforce, right? Those are the people who work here, live in Southborough and work. But by 2020, we expect that population to decline a little bit, and by 2030, it will actually be lower than it was in 1990. Now again, that's the big if current trends continue. So then what's happening to people my age? Or, well, Maybe a few of you. This is what's going to happen to Southborough according to these projections. Back in 1990, less than 10% of the population was 65 or over. By 2000, it was even lower. It was 8.1%. By 2010, however, it was back to 11.3%, and then look what happens. It explodes to 18.6%, almost 1 in 5, according to these projections by 2020, and by 2030, it's almost 30% of the population, up from 8.1%. Now that's happening nationwide, but it's happening even faster in New England than the rest of the nation, and it's happening faster in Massachusetts than any other state but Connecticut. And that aging of the population is a concern, and a large part of it for the reason that Alan pointed out. Where does the labor force come from? And if we can't keep young people here and attract them, will businesses come here? And so this is the kind of change that we project happening. Next slide. How will I sum this up? Well, number one, the Commonwealth has turned the economic corner, is now growing steadily, much better than the nation as a whole. Over recently, about the same as the nation as a whole. Number two, Southborough is more than sharing in this gain. That's great news. Number three, Massachusetts, however, is on the verge of the most important demographic revolution since World War II. And it's going to affect everything. So at the end of World War II, folks come home, they marry, and they have tons of kids. I'm one of them. Well, actually not. I was born in 1944, right? And what happened was that we had a demographic revolution where we had this mammoth baby boom generation of over 70 million young kids. And now we're retiring or hitting age 65 nationwide at a rate of 10,000 every day between now and 2030. And it's happening even faster here. But when we had that revolution, what was happening? People were starting to have families. They were leaving central cities like crazy. I grew up in Detroit. In 1950, Detroit was the richest city on the planet Earth. It still was in 1960 because of the auto industry and the auto union, which was very important, right? But people left Detroit, they left Boston, and they moved to suburbs, and then kept moving further and further out until they came to Southborough. Okay? That's basically what happened. So Boston goes from 801,000 residents in 1950 to 560,000 in 1980. And many people think that that happened because of the school busing explosion. 2/3 of that happened before school busing. Most of it happened between 1950 and 1970. And they were coming to the suburbs for the schools, they were coming to the suburbs for work, they were coming to the suburbs for lovely areas like Southborough. But now that population of real young people, kids, is shrinking. The population of older citizens is rising and will rise almost inevitably. And the question is, what will that mean for communities throughout Massachusetts in several ways? Next slide. What will this mean for, first of all, meeting our housing needs? So most of our communities, I haven't looked at Southfield, but we will be in a report coming out in December, has very little multi-unit housing, right? Now my wife and I, we're empty nesters. We have a big house in Cambridge. We don't need that house anymore. But I hit 70 years old next month. December 27th, we can celebrate my 70th birthday. I'm not ready for this. My wife is 66, and we're starting to look around for new housing for us that will meet our needs. And we are really interested in having housing with great amenities. But there's only one we really, really want. It's called an elevator. We want an elevator. Because marching up 3 flights of stairs as we do now is not going to work for us for very long. Many of the residents of Southborough, as you could see by just the age profile projected into the future, are probably going to be thinking about moving out of their current homes. The question is, do you want them to stay in Southborough? Or will they be forced to move somewhere else? And that will mean, are you prepared in Southborough to think about some new zoning? Are you prepared to think about accessory apartments? Are you willing to think about more multifamily housing targeted to that population group? not for unwashed masses moving into Southborough. This is for your own folks. That's question number one. Next slide. Providing adequate transportation. I actually think there's something going really well for communities like Southfield. It's the gridlock of our highway system. So I come out here from Cambridge, and I've been driving over the state. I've done over 12,000 miles this year on my car, and I've never left the state except for one trip up to Windham, New Hampshire, because we're working in 70 different communities through our EdSat program that David talked about. But I'm in great shape because I get on the turnpike and fly out here in about 21 minutes, right? While I watch people coming in on the pike backed up beyond Framingham. And if you really want a horror show, try coming up Route 3 on a Monday morning. Or going out Route 2, coming in on Route 2 from Concord and Lexington, you've got to be certifiable to even put up with that. Well, young people are not going to put up with that. They don't want it. I tried as a graduation present to give my son my wonderful 2009 low-mileage car until recently. He wouldn't take it. He doesn't want it. He doesn't want to commute. He takes public transit, and he wants to live near work. But what is going to happen is, because we're not going to expand our highway system very much, there's no room for it, we might expand commuter rail a little bit, businesses are going to start going where the people are. And if we can attract young people here, businesses will also want to come here because that's where the labor force will be. So transportation is going to be very, very important. Next, delivering appropriate social services. During most of this time, we provided social services for kids because that's what was the growing population. We're now going to have an aging population, and the question is, will Southfield have the kind of social services so that our aging population will not only want to live here, but thrive here? And finally, what do we do about future economic development, which is where we began this morning? As our population ages, more and more of us, like me, are going to be on fixed or lower incomes, right? That is going to mean that it's going to be more and more difficult to do property tax overrides, raising property tax revenues on residents. It's going to mean that more and more of us are going to want to spread the tax base beyond the residential tax base in order to support our population and not overtax them. We're not going to get much help from the state government in additional local aid. They're going to have enough structural deficits just dealing with pensions and with healthcare costs. And we're not going to get, as far as I can tell, particularly after yesterday's election, any help from the federal government. We're on our own here in Southborough. We're on our own in 351 towns and cities in Massachusetts. And the question is, those communities like Southborough that continue to attract business and spread more of the tax base in a fair way to the commercial sector as well as the residential sector will make it possible for Southborough to continue to prosper in the future. So these are the kinds of changes that we expect to see demographically. They'll affect the economy. They'll affect the need for social services. They'll affect what we do with our schools. But this is a destiny you can control. And my impression is this wonderful meeting is part of the way we think about that future and how we can kind of dream about what we want in that future and then take steps now to make sure we get to that future that we dream about. Thank you very much. And now this is your time to ask some questions, and let's get into a discussion. You saw a lot about the economy. You saw something about demography. But this is what I would like you to do, and that is start out by telling me what you would like to see Southborough look like 10, 15, 20 years from now. What's your dream about Southborough? What do you like about it? What are your worries about it? What are your hopes for it? And we're going to see if we can get this door closed again. Is that bothering you?
Can you get that? I'll get it.
There we go. We got it. Oh, All right. So let's start with just a few of you. Anybody who wants to volunteer, tell us what you really love about Southborough, and then where you'd like to see Southborough be, let's say over the next 15 to 20 years. Anybody want to start? Come on. I don't want to start calling on people. Let's start over here. You want to stand up and tell us who you are?
Joanne O'Leary. I work at NSTAR. Love the ruralness of it. Love the opportunity of walking through different pathways. I think what I'd love to see is just more walking paths, maybe sidewalks on the large main roads for safety. And I just love the character of the town. The location is ideal, and I'd like to keep a lot of what I currently see.
Very good. Over here.
I'm Claire Reynolds. I'd like to see a Route 9 without vacancy signs, so that we take advantage and increase the development that we have, particularly with professional office space that we have along Route 9. I would like to see that increase.
Okay. So some more commercial development
Yes.
along Route 9. Yes.
I'm Jessica Strunken from the 495 METROWEST Partnership. To dovetail on that point, I think the way to get to filling those spaces is to make sure that traffic is flowing more smoothly on Route 9. So I'd like to see some infrastructure improvements and investment in that area.
Okay. Bonnie.
I would really like to see,
And who are you?
might be out for METROWEST Chamber, I would really like to see a way to encourage young people to actually live in this area, because we have many great amenities. So let's expand amenities. Let's look at the ways that we can keep young people here. And when I look at those demographic slides and I see that decline in the population, it's not going to be a good thing. So I think we really need to find a way to make young people really want to be out here.
Behind you.
My name is Tom Moskius with Commerce Bank and the EDC here at Southborough. I'd like to see another restaurant. Thank you very much.
Second restaurant.
Young people. Yeah.
That's the kind of amenities I think Bonnie was talking about. Back there.
Bill Pizzoni, I'm with the Southborough Economic Development and the partnership and Marlborough Economic Development. And all the things we were talking about are great, but if we're going to bring the kids here, we need more than a restaurant in downtown. We need to create more of a village atmosphere downtown. We've got the two schools, they're bolstering, but there just has to be some more commercial activity down there that will draw the people to come there and they'll hang out. So I'd like to see that change. If we can't step back to 1969 when I first moved.
Very good. Over here.
I'm Kathy Bartolini, and I'm Vice Chair of the Planning Board. I'd like to see, as the master plan states, a more diversified variety of housing types permitted in the community, at not only types, but a varying of price ranges as well. The point that our young people aren't living here, my daughter moved out 3 months ago because you can't afford to be here. And even if you can afford to be here, why do you want to be here? If you have to hop in your automobile to find a grocery store, to buy a greeting card, whatever the day-to-day needs that you have, and also just how often you drive over to Northborough for the school and stuff, they're looking at what services does Southborough provide other than beauty.
Very good. Over here.
Hi, I'm Barb Feiner, the founder of Tech Sandbox, which is regional, even though we're based in Hopkinton. I think the public transportation issue is definitely a challenge. I don't know what the data is about how many people live in Southborough and commute more than 10 miles to their jobs, but that's probably one of the things that's getting in the way of some of the growth. Personally, I teach at Emerson College. I can't even park at the Southborough train to go into Boston unless I'm there like 6:30 in the morning. So, there's some problems with that, and also going up and down the 495 corridor. There's a lot of traffic I think we could remove if there was some form of, I would love a train in the middle of 495, but that's a little too slow. You gotta have a vision. Anyway.
Absolutely, you have to have a vision. All the way back here.
Maureen Ferguson, Recreation Department and resident as well. To Bill's point, bringing the kids out to the center of town, how do you get them there? This is not a walkable community. It's not safe for the kids to be walking on Route 30, which has no sidewalks. Getting kids across Route 9 is not safe. I used to live on the other side. Driving them back everywhere, back and forth, drive. These kids can't walk and ride in the taxi.
So I'm hearing transportation, I'm hearing housing, I'm hearing amenities, and continued commercial development. Did I hear that right? A couple more? Yes.
I'm Sam Stivers, resident of Southborough. I think there's a lot of great information here, a lot of good objectives, but to me, an important process element here is what we do about all this stuff. And I guess I would look to our planning board, our economic development committee, our board of selectmen to take all of this and put together a plan that says, here is where we want to go, here is what we need to do to get there, and that ripples through things like what kind of businesses do we need to attract, what kind of businesses do we need to discourage, et cetera, et cetera. And my sense is that it's been a random event pretty much historically. And it seems to me we can help ourselves considerably by having a more specific, focused set of objectives and building support mechanisms to reach those objectives. I'm reminded to paraphrase a famous quip, if you don't have a destination, any road will get you there. And so it seems to me we need to be a lot more focused. We've got good information here, and out of the master plan process from a number of years ago, we've got some good objectives. It's not clear to me how many of those are still foremost in people's minds. But we need to manage the process, I think, a lot more actively than we have historically if we want a reasonable chance of success.
Chris?
I'm Chris Robbins. I'm on the Economic Development Committee. I think one of the key things to all these wish lists is we need a zoning bylaw that is current. This has been stopped in its tracks, and we're competing against towns for business. And if we want to grow and prosper and have these things, we have to have a zoning bylaw that's easy to use and enables us to keep our open space and all the good things we need.
Very good. Further? Are there some people here who are on either town selectmen or executives in Southborough? Daniel, you want to talk to maybe some of these issues about planning?
Well, no, so Dan Kalenda, member of the Economic Development Committee and also on the Board of Selectmen. And I think that, you know, permitting is one of the large issues. We've heard it over the years. It's a challenge. It has been a challenge. It's getting better. So we have a new town planner, Jen Burney. She is absolutely outstanding. We have Mark Robideau, our building inspector. Incredible gentleman to work with. So what we are trying to do as you know, your executive body of the town is to identify areas for improvement, help shepherd those through, and then, you know, bring folks together so that you know, you understand who we are. You are our customers. You are the economic engine for our community. And what can we do as town officials to help you folks prosper? So I'm hearing a lot today. I've heard a lot of analytics and demographics that I didn't know about before. Some of which actually, you know, you and Maureen had provided us, but this is good updated information. You know, we're looking for the same things I think that many in the room are looking for, to grow our commercial base, but also do it in a manner that is reflective of the rural character that we have in Southborough and the beauty that we all enjoy about working here and living here. So, you know, I guess I do know that we're investing in some of these areas to help businesses grow and prosper and make doing business in Southborough an easier process. So that's what I will offer you. That's what I'm hearing, some of the feedback. And also just another thing, I think one of the wonderful things about this, and we haven't done this before, this is the first time that we've put one of these together. But what an opportunity for businesses to get to know each other when previously maybe you haven't. To get to know, you know, knuckleheads like me on the Board of Selectmen. All right, who can I go to? You heard from Paul Semino earlier, he had to go. But who can I go to, you know, if I have a problem in town? You have a face with a name. You've got Mark Purple, Vanessa Hale, outstanding representatives, you know, in town government, you know, to help you and are receptive to questions and concerns that you may have about doing business in Southborough and growing in Southborough.
Very good. Let me ask another question. We've been working very closely with virtually all the communities of METROWEST. We've been working closely with Bonnie and the METROWEST Chamber. One of the things that I think is true, particularly with your representatives and your state senator here, is that we should also be thinking as a region and how we work together, the North Boroughs, the West Boroughs, Framingham, Natick. We've got universities, we've got community colleges, we've got vocational schools, we've got chambers, and how we really almost market METROWEST as the kind of next innovation district of the state. And part of it is you dreaming about your own future. And part of it, I think, is getting together with people from the other communities so that you can dream together. Because many of the people who work here live maybe in Northborough or Westborough or somewhere else. And many of the people live here, work somewhere else in the region. And so you're kind of region-wide. And I think that's another way of thinking about it. If you were to ask me, how I would go about it, is every once in a while you go through a master plan. That's wonderful. But even before you start with a master plan, I've been suggesting to communities that they need to go through what is often called a SWOT analysis, S-W-O-T. What are your strengths? Well, you've got gobs of strengths. You've got more strengths than almost any community I know. But you also want to take a look at not only your strengths, but your weaknesses. And what are those? And some of those may be weaknesses of the future of what your demographics might be. And then you identify your opportunities. What are our opportunities for new business, for attracting young people? And then you also think about some of the threats. They may be demographic threats, or they may be economic threats, or they may be threats completely outside of your control. But at least you need to study those. So that would be the first step, a SWOT analysis. But the second is, kind of knowing that, tell me what you want this community to look like, just the way you did here. And then you get down to the hard work. What does that mean for your downtown area? What does that mean for zoning reform? What does that mean for new forms of housing, for older folks and for younger folks? And they're going to actually need housing which is a lot different than the traditional single-family home with the two-car garage attached here in Southborough. Going through those steps, but always thinking about what your dream is, I think is the best way to do it. Do you want to add to this?
I think the ideas that Barry suggested are good, because I think a SWOT analysis is good. When I kind of look at Southborough, as I see it now, there is, you notice the establishments were kind of on par with the other areas. They're a little lower in Southborough than what you would expect to see. So that drives it. When someone has a startup, is it easy to start a business in Southborough? I don't have the answer to that. Okay. Is there someone to facilitate a startup? Because given your local education achievement, I assume someone looking at a startup is probably maybe the kind of business you want to locate in Southborough, just by the criteria, just by the demographics and education level and skill level here. So these are kind of thinking it through, and that's a little weakness, I think, but it's also an opportunity, because all business comes from startups. Okay, so that's one place where the public sector can play a role, facilitate it, and things like that. So I think there's plenty of opportunities when you go from the big issue down to the steps to get there. So that's just kind of one thought I had.
I might add, and I'm thinking about this because this is not really relevant to Southborough except in one way. This past year I've been on sabbatical, and I've been at the Boston Federal Reserve Bank. My day job is basically to set world interest rates, but when I'm not doing that, I actually have nothing to do with that. I actually worked with a group in the Community Outreach Department of the Fed, which worked with 20 working cities here in Massachusetts. And they brought in lots of money, and they had a competition. The working cities are what we call the gateway cities, or you might think of them as the older industrial cities. They're all cities, so they all have mayors. They have a median family income below the average in the state and a poverty rate above the average in the state, and all have over 30,000 residents. And so we recently did an analysis of it, and we compared the results that we did with EdSat. We've done that in 70 communities, including Southborough, with their employment growth rates, like you saw here for Southborough. And this is what amazed me. Of all the cities in Massachusetts, but particularly these 20 older industrial cities, which city do you think had the fastest employment growth between 2001 and 2013? Think of cities. Pardon? Chelsea was number 1. What was number 2? Lawrence. Now, that blew my mind. I know Lawrence. I've been to Lawrence a lot. And so we went back and we said, why have Chelsea and Lawrence done so well? Number 1, they've done a spectacular job of taking older industrial sites and repurposing them for all these new small businesses that you'll see in these old mill buildings in Lawrence. They've had terrific leadership, particularly in Chelsea under Jay Ash, the city manager. The second thing is they marketed the hell out of themselves. They really tried to change people's image of what Lawrence and Chelsea were. And the way they did that was through their websites, by working with their businesses that were already there and going out and doing cross-marketing, meaning they were working, the municipal leaders were working with the business leaders to tell you what Lawrence is going to be like tomorrow, not what it was yesterday. We talk about it in terms of changing people's cognitive maps. The example I love to use about changing how important it is to do marketing, which I've never done, I'm an economist, not a business major, is Northeastern University this past year had almost 50,000 applications for 2,800 freshman slots. More young people applied to Northeastern University than any other private university in the country. But the real question to me as a professor was, how do we decide who should get into Northeastern? How do we go through, what? Your son, right. Yes, good. Is he the bassoon player?
No, he's the soccer player.
We actually need, well, we need soccer players too, but we really do need a bassoonist. So I went to the senior vice president for enrollment management, Philly Mantello, who's this brilliant person. And I said, how do we do this? How do we go through 50,000 applications? He says, we actually hire a lot of temps. And we've trained them a little bit, and we get the same temps coming back every year. And for about 3 months, that's all they do is they read applications. And they have one simple job. Well, not so simple. To take these 50,000 applications and put them into one of 2 piles. The discard pile, we don't call it that. We send out a nice letter, you're brilliant, but you don't quite fit here. And to be further considered. And that's what the temps do. And then we have a professional staff that go through this much smaller pile. So I turned to Philly and I said, well, how long does each application on average get in terms of the attention of these temps? Because I know that 5 years ago when my son applied to college, we spent weeks and months working on this, right? He had to write essays and take the SATs and get letters of recommendation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We sweated bricks. Answer, 6 minutes. That's how long an application is reviewed. Okay? It turns out, by the way, if any of you still have college-ready kids, the first paragraph of the essay is really critical. In fact, you don't really have to worry about much of the rest. But the first, because that's all the temps read, right? So if they're not grabbed by the first paragraph, very important. Well, the same thing is true about communities. How do you show the world who you are and what your dreams are? Because business leaders want to know that. They want to know what your municipal process is like. And so it's very important to get zoning appeals right. It's very important to expedite permitting and so forth. But it's also important to kind of provide an image of what your dream is about this community. Because when businesses come here, they're not coming here for a month or a year. They're coming here, they hope, for some time. And that's the kind of image you need to project, and you need to also understand how to project it. When we ask these location specialists, we surveyed 240 of them nationwide, we said, what is the first thing you look at when you're considering a town you know nothing about? And they laughed. They said, we do the same thing you do. We Google them. and we look at the town or city website to see what information we can glean from that. And that's what the temp is doing. So they put some of those towns into discard pile, and then the others for further consideration. So even working to figure out not only who you are, but how you want to be perceived turns out to be really important. Cynthia, please.
Thank you, Barry. This was a great presentation. I found myself asking all kinds of different questions afterward, which I think is just the appropriate response. Not necessarily relative specifically to Southborough, but one of the things we've been talking about is labor or talent and the importance of keeping young people here, of attracting new labor here. One of the issues that we've been wrestling with, the Senator and I and the rest of the legislature on Beacon Hill, is the issue of non-compete agreements. And I'm just wondering, from an economic standpoint, do you have a position on that, or any sort of things to consider with respect to these issues with non-competes?
I haven't really studied non-competes. What non-competes are is I've worked for a high-tech firm for a number of years. I decide to move on, and the question is, where can I move? Can I move to any other company, and so forth, right? And I generally believe in a free labor market, that people should be able to move, and if they move from HP to Dell or whatever, they should be allowed to do it. I also understand it can be a serious problem for firms, particularly in getting them to share some of their business information with their own employees, because you don't want to share it with them and then have them share it with their competitors. So I don't really have a position on that issue, but I think it needs further consideration. And I think for some firms, obviously it's very, very important, they're lobbying, that we keep non-competes. I know a lot of workers are interested in being able to move more easily and not be constrained by that. But I must admit I haven't thought a lot about it. I don't know if either of you have thought much about that particular issue. Senator?
So Barry, thanks again for coming here. And as the Senator for Marlborough, Northborough, Westborough, and Southborough area, I hear a lot of talk about the need for communities to work together for a regional plan for economic development, but I think often when the rubber hits the road, I don't see a lot of that in practice. And I'm just wondering if you have any sort of toolkit or analysis or even example of other parts of the state that have done a successful job of that. And I just want to give a very specific example, is that I represent the towns of Sudbury and Marlborough, and the town of Sudbury, which wants to do some economic development near the Marlborough border, had offered to pay into the Marlborough wastewater treatment system in order to develop their part of town. And the response from the Marlborough City Council was, we're not going to agree to that because we don't want competition with the economic development in Marlborough. And so I'm just wondering if there's any analysis of other parts of the state or a toolkit about the actual benefit of regional planning or regional economic development across town borders.
There's very little of it. We have 351 towns and cities, and each one of us, has, our own interests in mind, number one. I am excited about some developments I'm seeing in Boston, and that is for the first time we have a mayor, Marty Walsh, who has actually gone across the large body of water called the Charles River to meet with the mayors of Somerville and Cambridge, and to begin thinking about a joint housing policy, for example, over what are we going to do with the 20 to 34-year-olds, including my graduate students and my postdocs and lots of medical residents and interns and other young professionals who are ganging up 2, 3 at a time and outcompeting working families for the second and third floors of triple deckers, which is 35% of the housing stock in those three communities, Boston, Cambridge, Somerville. So we're beginning to get mayors getting together to talk about common problems that they have. And I think the best thing to do here is for regions to focus on a common problem where they all benefit. So for instance, in some communities it's water, in some communities it's wastewater, in some communities it's talent retention, in some communities it's how can we improve our regional vocational technical school because we know that that's critical for the manufacturing sector and for other trades. So I think what it is not thinking about necessarily an entire regional plan and start with that. That has too many entanglements. It's starting with a few issues where you can get buy-in, where we all think it's a positive-sum game, rather than a zero-sum game. Yes, sir.
Bill Pizzoni again. This is a pet peeve of mine, and it goes back a long time, the regionalization aspect of it. And Bonnie and all the other chambers in the area, and Paul and the partnership, and Marlboro Economic Development, over the last 5 to 7 years, are really starting to communicate a little bit more. And I see a change in the tide, let's say. The key is, though, is for communities like Southborough to figure out what they are and what they aren't. Like you said, what do we have that's good? What are our positives? What are our negatives? How do we best fit into the regional plan? I mean, half of this community is all water. Probably another third of it is institutional properties owned like this. So we have a lot of preserved land already in this community. We know we're not going to build hotels. We've got them all around us, Marlboro, Westboro, Framingham. We don't need hospitality. We have to figure out what our identity is going to be. And is that, a high-level community for people that work in other areas? Some of the buildings and commercialization will be here in town, but we have very limited areas. We have to think on a regional basis, what can we provide to the whole area? And to the Senator's point, it's a long road. It has been a long road. I know that all the chambers and Paul at the partnership and at Marlboro Economic Development, it's been tough. I mean, 3 years ago, we were fighting over TJX between Framingham and Marlboro when we should have been preserving them. I mean, and that result was great. But I think we're heading in that right direction. But I guess what I want to ask you is, how do we really define what we want to be and what our best attributes are to move forward?
Well, I'm the last person in the room who could answer that question, because I don't live here. I live in Cambridge. I think what you want to do is continue doing what you've done here. This is the only time I've seen this happen. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, David. I've been all over the state. I've been in 70 towns and cities where we've done EdSet. The only time we've come together with people like this has been over the very narrow issue of economic development. You're bringing up the broader issues of your future. And I think, working together like this is going to be very important. Let me tell you something else that I think is going to be really important. I've been working with the Microsoft company, despite the fact that I can't stand Windows 8. And we had them help us sponsor a spectacular 15th anniversary gala of the Dukakis Center, which I founded 15 years ago with others. And we had all these fabulous exhibits of the work we've done on EdSat and economic development with the state and with communities and with chambers. We did one on housing, we did one on urban resilience and climate change, one on data, one on transportation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in all of this, we also got to know that Microsoft has been thinking really hard and has created a whole division called Enterprise Social. They have a division called Enterprise Business, which is all the kind of business applications of Microsoft software. And now they've started to realize that people who really need new applications are community leaders, town and city leaders. And we've been meeting with them and talking about what do communities need. Well, one of them, of course, is just a better understanding of what 9,700 residents of Southborough want. Well, they can't all come to town meeting, and they don't. Many are too busy. They don't all come to school committee meetings, I bet. Is it possible to use the new technology to allow people to be part of town meeting of all, which is a term I use? And in fact, they have an application called Town Meeting, where people can actually be involved in town meeting in a time-sensitive way. Possibly even come to town meeting but not leave their computer station at home. Or see what happened at town meeting asynchronously at 2 o'clock in the morning after they've put their child to sleep. To what extent could town leaders do instant polling or surveying of their entire constituencies on key issues? Like, what is your dream about Southborough? It's possible now to do that at almost no expense whatsoever. What we've seen in one community after another, I'm sure it's never, ever, ever happened in Southborough, is that you've wanted to do a project, but there have been a small handful of people who perhaps have too much of a chip on their shoulder and way too much time on, who are very noisy, very loud, but don't necessarily represent the community at all. But they have the time to show up at every meeting and drone on and on and on. Look, I live in Cambridge. You want to see this, right? I work with the Cambridge Housing Authority. Enough said. So one of the things is how do we get more people to weigh in on issues? I mean, we had a tiny, I think nationwide, less than 42% of the registered voters turned out for election on Tuesday. Right? That's even, that's getting them to go to the polls. We need to get more people involved, because I think when we get more people involved, including using new technologies to involve them, we're going to have many more ideas, and we're also going to see that there's much more cohesion rather than the noise that we often see everywhere but, of course, in Southborough. So those are some of the other things I would think about. David?
Just a sort of a comment and then a question for Barry and the rest of the panel. First, I think we have heard the message of regionalization, and it's one that I share as well. I think that's important because my view is what's good for Marlborough and Framingham is good for Southborough as well. And there's a lot of companies that are doing business in all of these towns. So we're already working on this event for next year, and it's going to be a regional event. So stay tuned for that. But the question that I have, coming out of the data that you projected, the sort of classic model of economic development is try and focus on commercial development. I think there's some consensus that if we're going to do that in Southborough, it ought to be on the Route 9 corridor. But the data that you've shown sort of makes me pessimistic about the town's ability to do that, in the sense that if we're not going to have a lot of new jobs, if the working population is going to be shrinking, the baby boomers are going to be retiring, is there going to be that kind of structural need for office and commercial space that is kind of the golden nugget from an economic development perspective? So can you sort of comment on that and give us some suggestions on how we ought to be approaching that question?
Yeah. I can give you some broad thoughts, and maybe Maureen and Alan have some too. As I said, the demographic projections we gave you here were projections. They're not necessarily destiny. In fact, if you don't like that projection, getting old, very few 20 to 34-year-olds, you begin to ask the kinds of questions that Bonnie and several of you were asking. How do we attract young people here? I can tell you, one of the things, if you can build the kind of housing they need, if you can improve on the transportation, yeah, young people would love to live in Boston, but it's a very, very expensive place to be. You can't live in Cambridge anymore. It's gone crazy. I think what's going to happen is that communities like Southborough, METROWEST in general, can become a new magnet for young people, both by producing the kind of housing that's appropriate for them, smaller housing at somewhat more affordable prices on land that isn't the most expensive land on the planet Earth outside of a few Middle Eastern capitals, oil capitals, or Shanghai, and have the set of amenities that get young people here, and particularly young people once they have kids and want to go to your very fine Southborough schools. So part of it is trying to figure out what you need to do so that these projections actually don't come true, right? And that's working on that. And then if you attract folks here and they definitely don't want to get on the Turnpike and 495 to commute downtown Boston, businesses are going to want to come here where they are. And as I said, I think earlier, maybe I forgot to say it, is I think in the old days it used to be businesses settled wherever they wanted and then people came to where the businesses were. It may be in the near future that just the reverse will happen. Businesses are going to come to where the people are because people are not going to want to travel long distances on crowded highways and inadequate public transit. So places like Southborough actually could become a magnet for both young people and the businesses that will be attracted by those young people.
Good news, thank you.
Yeah. Maureen, Alan, any thoughts?
Well, I agree with Barry in that these demographic projections are not good at the more detailed geographic level you get, the less sure are these demographic projections. We can be pretty sure about the population in the nation less sure about the population of Massachusetts, and least sure about the population of any locality because of the way migration works. So this doesn't have to be your destiny. I think, many of you talked about amenities and how you'd like to see this to be a nice place to live. And when you think about it, that's the primary and first job of a local government, is to make the place a nice place to live. And that's how you're going to attract the people. The other side of the equation is, well, how do we get the revenues for that? And that's the economic development side. And on that, I particularly like what you were saying, Senator, about the example of these two towns that were fighting over a company, when there's this concept in economics called agglomeration, which suggests that you should work as a region, because once you attract one business, doesn't matter which community in the region, that helps attract other businesses, and that will support the whole region. And of course, to make this all work, you have to connect your community, to the wider regional economy, and that takes good public planning, not just at the local level, but you have to be involved too in the state government and federal government as well. So it takes many players to do it. But if you begin by focusing on, well, how can we just make Southborough a nice place to live? I mean, that's where it all starts.
Yeah, to follow up, I think there's a couple of threads here. One is, I think the IDing of a common problem in the region is very helpful. I would pick transportation right off the bat, because I think everyone who works or lives in any community in Metro West complains about transportation. It's, and coming out, it was very interesting coming out on 9 this morning, which was, not bad headed west, and a C headed east. Never mind, I live near exit 13. I can tell you every morning, 11, 12, 13 on the Pike, backs up in all directions because so many people are coming here to work from beyond 495, and that's one of the pressures on housing in this area. They're buying out in central Mass because it's the only house they can afford. Conversely, they're getting in the car and driving up and down. So what you have is a tremendous amount of in and out within Metro West, and then in and out of Metro West. So anything that facilitates transportation, but it's also here. If there was a regular bus service from downtown Southborough up and down 9, up and down 30, you might find a different mix of residents choosing to live here because there is an alternative to your car, okay, or a bus that takes right to the nearest train station. But the other issues, I think, also is the larger Metro West issue. I think we can, when I was looking at the, I think it was Allen's unemployment, the unemployment map, where was the biggest pot? Where was the center of the state? It was Metro West, the big yellow, the low unemployment rates. We're not marketing any of that. We're not thinking of ourselves as a region with all the assets we bring to the table. And I think, there's a synergy for living here, there's a synergy for locating your business here, even with the nervousness about future labor force and all these other things. And I think we have to work with that and be mindful of that. And Southborough is very much a part of that. You're kind of the center, when you put that Metro West up, there you were, you're right in the middle. So I think these are things to think about, that you have a tie to the larger region, and it's very positive. But I also think in the immediate term, there are very common goals that would benefit all. One would be transportation. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank all of you for inviting us here today. This has been an amazing experience for me. I hope it was for you too. I want you to know that the Dukakis Center, Alan, myself, our staff, stand ready as your friend to continue to work with you in any way you wish. And you have just a spectacular resource at Framingham State with Merck. You're in great shape. The last thing I want to say is that, and maybe this comes out of the 1960s when I grew up, like a few of you in the room, is that you want to work on the problems and the threats and some of the issues that come up here. But you should also take time to celebrate all the great things that are here. You should take time for dance and song. It's as important as also dealing with your issues, because you have a great community, you have a great region, You're doing wonderful things. And the test of that is you all came here this morning. So thank you very much.